The Madagascar bloom happens to the east of Madagascar. It's quite unusual in that most blooms sort of happen in situ. This one sort of starts at Madagascar and heads eastwards. It grows, so it propagates, which is quite unusual, so which is why it's interesting. At its largest extent, it covers about a third the area of Europe.
Welcome back to the National Oceanography Centre's Into the Blue podcast, where we talk to the people leading the way in raising the profile of the ocean through research, exploration and advocacy. We hope you enjoy today's episode. Hello, I'm Dr. Zoe Jacobs, and today I'm joined by Professor Meric Srokosz to discuss how a recent study has discovered that increasing drought events in southern Africa could benefit the Indian Ocean marine life and atmospheric carbon removal. So welcome, Meric. Thank you so much for joining us today.
My pleasure.
So before we start, can you tell us a bit about your career and your time at NOC? How long have you been working at NOC for?
Oh, I've been working at NOC since it opened, but my career goes back a little further, back to the 1970s. So I started out in waves, doing a PhD in Bristol, and then I went to work for the Institute of Oceanographic Sciences, which eventually morphed into what is now called National Oceanography Centre. So I've done a number of things over my career, worked with NASA and the European Space Agency, measuring things from space. I've worked on the Agulhas and Madagascar current systems, which is relevant to our chat today, and on the effects of physical processes on biology. And I was also responsible for looking after the Rapid Climate Change Programme for a good part of my career. So quite varied.
Yeah, we've spoken about quite a few of those topics already on the podcast. I'm glad that we can finally get something about the Madagascar bloom in today. So it's a subject that we've touched on before in the podcast, but can you tell us what phytoplankton is and why do we care about it?
Well, phytoplankton are the bottom of the food chain in the ocean. They're basically algae, bacteria that photosynthesize, so just like plants on land, and they produce chlorophyll, which is why we can measure them from space, because they change the colour of the water from blue to green, and that's detectable by satellite. So they are a key part of the food chain, being at the bottom. Think of grass on land, and then things eat that, and so on, up to the cows and etc.
Got it. So it's important for fisheries and all kinds of marine life. And what is meant by the term bloom? So we have phytoplankton blooms in the ocean. What does that actually mean?
Just like your garden blooms in the spring, because the sun it's warmer and sunnier, the ocean can also bloom. We have the phytoplankton require nutrients and they require light. So for large parts of the ocean, they get the nutrients because in winter you get mixing, that brings nutrients to the surface, and then in the spring you get more light levels increasing, so with the nutrients and the light levels, the plankton can grow just like your plants in your garden.
Okay, so it's a seasonal thing.
Yes.
Yeah. And does this happen everywhere in the global oceans, or is it kind of confined to certain regions?
Well, it's largely at mid to high latitudes. Tropical oceans tend to work slightly differently. So in our part of the Atlantic, sort of to the west of the UK, we get blooms every spring.
Okay, that makes sense. So this bloom was the focus of a very recent study. And so this Madagascar bloom, why was it so important? Why do we care about this one in particular, and if it happens all around the world?
Okay. The Madagascar bloom happens to the east of Madagascar. It's quite unusual in that most blooms sort of happen in situ. This one sort of starts at Madagascar and heads eastwards. It grows, so it propagates, which is quite unusual, so which is why it's interesting. At its largest extent, it's covered about a third the area of Europe.
Oh, wow.
So quite a big area of the ocean. And it's involved in obviously taking carbon dioxide in the atmosphere that's absorbed into the water and used by the plants. Now, the reason this particular bloom in 2019 was unusual was because normally this bloom happens in the late austral summer, so February to April. This one actually happened, if you like, the previous year. It started in November, and by February the following year it had more or less finished. So it was a completely different bloom. Well, it wasn't a different bloom. It was a different timing of the bloom, and it was 3 times as, in terms of the amount of chlorophyll it produced, was about 3 times what you would normally see in that area. So it was quite significant, and the question was, why did that happen? And what were the influences to make that happen?
Okay. So what were the findings of the study?
So what we found was that there's quite complicated things going on. Drought in Southern Africa led to the land drying out, and then the wind blew and blew particles, small particles called aerosols, into the atmosphere. They were transported out over the ocean to the east of Madagascar, and then it rained. That washes the particles out of the atmosphere into the ocean, and that provides nutrients iron probably that helped the plankton to grow. So the bloom happened because of this complicated land, atmosphere, ocean interaction, and that led to this early bloom because it happened in November rather than much later, which we'll be looking in February for the normal bloom. And so this happened then. And also because this provided so much nutrients, there was a lot more phytoplankton growth, so 3 times as much as a normal bloom would produce. Okay. So it was a significant event.
Yeah, kind of lots of factors kind of aligned at the right time.
Yes.
So is that in a normal year, for example, so outside of 2019, is that the kind of the same mechanism that would happen? Would you need that iron input for it to initiate the bloom?
Yeah, that's what we think is happening on a normal year, is that the iron input is coming not through the atmosphere, but just from Madagascar, probably from the coastal regions. The currents are transporting iron from the sediments off to the east of Madagascar and then causing the bloom. That's our current understanding.
Yeah, I see. So in 2019, the drought in southern Africa and the kind of transport of that airborne
iron produced the bloom earlier than expected.
Yeah. Early initiation of the bloom, and much stronger because more nutrients. Got it.
Yes.
What techniques were used then to study this?
Okay, so we used a variety of techniques. Obviously, satellite data, we can see the bloom from space, which is how we were aware it had happened because the bloom made a big signature, 3 times as much chlorophyll that stands out much more clearly. It was obviously interesting because it was early, so then that led us to investigate using other satellite observations, like observations of currents and temperatures. And then we realised that there must be iron being provided, nutrient being provided somehow. And we were aware of some work being done in Australia where they were looking at forest fires, which had done a similar effect where the forest fires produced particles that went into the atmosphere, went to the east of Australia and caused a bloom in the ocean. So we started to look at possible land sources of iron, and therefore that's how we got to the drought and the particle transfer. But to follow that up, we also used models because we tracked the particles in a model. To see where particles, if they originated in South Africa, where they'd end up. And lo and behold, they would have ended up over this part of the ocean, which is what we saw. We also used models to look at the deposition, so looking at how that would, those particles would actually fall out of the atmosphere onto the ocean. And then we also used Algae floats, which are in situ measuring floats, temperature and salinity, so we could see what was going on in the ocean itself, as well as looking from space from above.
Yeah, cool. So you've literally used a whole range of different methods to get
everything you can possibly think of, almost.
Well, it's needed sometimes, isn't it, to get the kind of the whole picture. So there was a huge bloom. It happened earlier. Loads of phytoplankton, lots of chlorophyll. What has that actually told us about what were the positive and negative effects of this?
Okay,
impacts.
I'm not sure there were any negative effects. In the sense that the plankton grew and bloomed, that provides food for other parts of the food chain. There was a cruise by some, I think they were French colleagues who were out there, and they found they were making measurements for other reasons. But one of the measurements we're making was how much carbon dioxide was being taken out of the atmosphere. So the positive thing about the bloom was that it caused more carbon dioxide to be drawn out of the atmosphere because like plants on land, the phytoplankton use carbon dioxide as they grow, so you absorb it into the water, the plants use it, therefore more can be absorbed into the water and the plants can use it. So there was definitely more drawdown of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, which was a good thing from a climate point of view, because you're reducing the CO2 in the atmosphere. So from that point of view, it had a very positive impact. Not a big enough impact because you have to do this. You have to have a lot of blooms to have a sort of really international, global type impact. But it had a localized, very important impact on bringing carbon dioxide in the atmosphere into the ocean. Yeah,
because that reminds me that isn't iron fertilization being kind of thought of as a potential way to increase carbon dioxide removal? We won't get into that, but that's kind of
that's the idea, that has been proposed. And basically, this is natural iron fertilization.
This is the idea,
so this is what's happening. It's naturally occurring. The advantage of naturally occurring is that it's natural. Whereas when we start to interfere with things, it becomes a little bit trickier.
Indeed. What about the impacts on fisheries and marine ecosystems? Has anyone done anything to have a look at that yet, or?
Well, that part of the ocean is quite remote, so there's not many measurements of those sorts of things. So as far as I know, nobody's found any particular impacts in terms of higher up the food chain. I'm not aware of any. Like I say, the main impact seems to have been on the carbon dioxide absorption and just on the growth of the phytoplankton. One assumes that those things that eat the phytoplankton will also have grown as a result of having more food, but we don't have any direct evidence of that.
Yeah, because I imagine it'd be quite complicated because you'd have like the initial food source for the fisheries, but then it could go a bit kind of out of control with all the respiring and the lowering of the oxygen and whatnot.
The other thing is that, I'm not sure how much fisheries goes on in that area.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Because it's quite a long way to the east of Madagascar.
That's true,
So I think there's a lot of coastal fisheries, a bit like when we were studying Tanzania or somewhere like that. But I'm not sure how much deep sea fisheries are in that area. Okay. So I'm not aware of much that's been done on that.
But if this kind of thing were to happen in a more coastal region, that there might well be impacts on fisheries.
There would be. Yeah.
Kind of makes me think actually about the recent, you were just talking about the Australian fires. I'm just wondering if the impact of the recent fires in California and the if lots of kind of ash deposition is happening over the ocean there. I mean, that could be
that depends on the wind direction.
Exactly.
So in California, generally the winds are from the west to the east.
Yeah.
At mid latitudes. So
it might be okay.
You're blowing things from California onto the middle of the USA, which is probably not still help.
Yeah,
if you go a bit further south and go to the Sahara, we know that Saharan dust blown to the east, because that's the prevailing wind direction down there, can fertilise the Atlantic. Yeah. So it depends which wind band, which east or west the winds are blowing, as to where it'll end up and how that will affect the ocean.
Yeah, the weather's a really important factor.
So it is the interaction of the land, the ocean, the atmosphere that makes this happen. It's not just like one factor.
Yeah. So do you think that climate change has made these kinds of events more or less frequent? Do we even know the answer to that question?
Well, this is the first time this one's been observed in this area, this sort of effect of the atmospheric dust and the fertilising. And there's the one, like I said, with the Australian wildfires. So in the sense that we are likely to have more drought and we're likely to have more wildfires, one would assume that in the future they may become more common. But these are in both the Australian case and in our Madagascar case, it's the first time it's been observed.
Okay.
So one event is difficult to draw any general conclusion from.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, it's definitely something to think about in future anyway.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you so much for taking part today.
That's all right. My pleasure.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the podcast. To ensure you don't miss out on future episodes, subscribe on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, or wherever you listen to podcasts. See you next time.